believe in the ripple effect.
What's up, everybody? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricky Varanus, and today we have a great episode for you. We have somebody who was directly involved with the Watergate scandal. He was on Nixon's defense team. He is an author, lecturer, attorney. Geoff Shepard is on today, and we go deep into the Watergate scandal. It's one of those things, historical events that everybody kind of knows the name, but I think a lot of people my age and younger, they don't really know the details. So we really go deep into it today. There's a lot of similarities with the JFK assassination in regards to there's so many rabbit holes you can go down, and then some even some of the same names like Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt. You're going to hear those names pop up, and which really makes those guys even more fascinating. If you've heard recently my JFK assassination specials I did a couple episodes ago, part 1 and part 2, you're going to hear some of the same names. You're going to hear us talk about Operation 40, Bay of Pigs, and it's amazing some of the similarities and some of the links to the two events. If you guys are doing your own research, look into these guys. It's so interesting when you really look into E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and Operation 40 and Bay of Pigs. It's really fascinating. And also the similarities to Russiagate. If you guys didn't know, the reason why every political scandal after Watergate ends with a gate is because of Watergate. The reason why it's called Russiagate is because of Watergate. So it's that important of a political scandal, but yet many people don't know the details about it and exactly what happened and how it unfolded. So we really go deep into it. I think we talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours on it, and really interesting conversation. I also want to thank everybody who's been listening to the show. 2018 was by far my best year for the Ripple Effect podcast. I can't thank everybody enough who's contacted me, telling me that they're enjoying the show, that they're new listeners, and they're going back in the archives and checking out the show. I'm super happy about the growth of the show, and I'm really excited about 2019. I'm happy about how big the audience has grown in 2018, but I hope everybody, all the new listeners, they go back and they check the archives the first couple years. I had some great guests on, some great conversations with people that I hope people run into, and I wish at that time I had a bigger audience because they're really important and interesting conversations. Some like the singer of 1 Minute Silence. They're from Northern Ireland and really fascinating lyricist and philosopher. And also Burton C. Bell from Fear Factory, Cell Dweller. Great conversation with him. Had an old show with Gregory A. Smith, who wrote the book and did the movie American Addict and American Addict 2. Those are documentaries that you probably ran into on Netflix. They're available on Netflix for a while, and really go into the pill epidemic and Big Pharma and all the ins and outs of Big Pharma. And Dr. Brzezinski, which I talked about, and just so many old episodes that I wish that I had. Oh, and Roger Stone was on twice. We talked about the JFK assassination the first time he was on in regards to the link to LBJ and his motivation, and then I had him on again to talk about the Clintons and the history of the Clintons. Abraham Bolden, who's the first black Secret Service agent. Really fascinating story. I mean, I just sat back and listened to him tell his story and I almost forgot I was hosting a podcast. So all these really amazing podcasts I've done throughout the years, and I hope people check them out. James Corbett, obviously, who's been on a bunch of times. We've had some really, really fun conversations in the past. Some where we talk about, I know some of the appearances he had on the show when we were both having kids kind of at the same time and becoming fathers. It was fun to kind of talk about that and talk about just fatherhood and some of our experiences with that. And it's nice. It's nice to kind of be able to give the listeners and myself, give them a different perspective of the guest. It's fun to be able to have my own show and to have people on, and really nobody tells me what I can and cannot talk about. So if I want to bullshit about, about whatever other topic we might want to talk about, it's okay and it's fun. So, but thanks again, guys. I really, really appreciate it. I don't know how else to say it. I'm trying to really put it into words, how much I'm blown away by how many people listen to this show. And it's one of those things where I knew eventually if I stayed at it, it was going to grow. But I guess when it actually does, and it's finally growing at a really drastic pace, I'm kind of stunned. I shouldn't be, right? Because I'm honest on the show, which I know for myself, that's something I look for in other shows. I try to show things from all perspectives, which sometimes can be a good thing or bad thing. I think some shows really blow up because they kind of play to one side or one perspective, but we try to show all perspectives, and I think you guys appreciate that. And I'm just a common guy and a normal dude who just has a full-time job, like probably most of my listeners, and is just trying to do my part to do something fulfilling and do something worth doing, and not just fall into the motions of becoming a machine of going to work and taking care of your priorities and then just making money and spending money and just basically your whole life revolving around that. So hopefully this is inspiring enough for some of you guys to start your own shows, maybe some of your own YouTube channels, or just chase something you also love doing and do it, because it will bring you some personal satisfaction. This show, for a long time, when it wasn't growing at a pace that I thought it would, it didn't really matter. And until now, it still doesn't matter, because I know that it's quality over quantity. And even when I had a smaller audience, I had quality listeners. I had people who really knew about the topics we were talking about, cared about the topics we were talking about, and really appreciated the type of conversations we would have on the show, just honest, open conversations about everything and anything. And that's how we learn, right? I mean, that's what makes humans the dominant species, is our understanding how important conversation is for growing and learning and surviving. So I guess I'll leave it at that. I think you guys get my point. But also remember, we have a Patreon page. If you guys want to support the show, please do. Remember, if you guys want to follow us on YouTube, you can do that, RV36 or the Ripple Effect Podcast. Just search that and you'll find our YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff. Thanks again, guys, from the bottom of my heart. I really, really appreciate everything that you guys have given me in regards to just motivation, inspiration, and love. So also thanks Sam Tripoli for having me on his show. That I got a lot of listeners from the Tinfoil Hat Podcast, and if you guys haven't checked that out, please check that out. I was recently on the Tinfoil Hat Podcast with Sam Tripoli, and we did a show on Big Pharma. And also, I got a lot of listeners from our Swapcast I did with the Conspiracy Farm guys and James Corbett and Sam Tripoli. So if you haven't checked that show out, please check that one out too. So thanks again, guys. I will see you in the next one, and enjoy the show. Peace. Watergate's one of those subjects that it's amazing, even with myself looking into it after knowing that we're going to talk about this today, how little I knew and how many rabbit holes you can go down with all the characters connected and all the conflicting opinions on why it happened, motives and all that stuff. So I'm glad we get to discuss it today.
I look forward to it too, Ricky. I was musing this morning that it's not that I had a front row seat during Watergate. I was on the stage. I mean, I was there I was a bit player because I was quite young, but I knew everybody involved and was there from the very outset to the very end. So I have a different story from what the public has been told about Watergate. It's an insider's story, but I'm glad that you're giving me a chance to tell it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that people learn who listen to this podcast is that history isn't black and white. It's not just simple and there's good guys and there's bad guys, and it's things aren't as obvious as we like to think they are. And a lot of times there's alternative perspectives and alternatives to history. You know, I've had people like Thaddeus Russell on, and people like Gerard Williams, who and people who question the history we've been told. And I think that's really important because, I mean, obviously we all kind of tend to agree that history is written by the winners, but the second you start questioning that history that you've been taught, people seem to think that, oh, well, that's not backed by, that's not true or whatnot. And it's, like one of my favorite quotes, it's easier to trick somebody than convince them they've been tricked. I think that's what happens with history, is that we're told something, we tend to believe that it's true, and we all kind of agree upon it. And then when you really look into it, you realize, oh, wow, there's way more to this story than meets the eye. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And
absolutely. We reflect what we've been taught, and if only one side of a story is presented, whether it's news clips or movies. One of my favorite examples of that are the Nixon interviews with David Frost after he left office. You can purchase a DVD of the actual Nixon-Frost interviews. But then there's this play and then movie by Peter Morgan from, 5 or 6 years ago, and it portrays a completely different set of facts. And people will say, no, I know Nixon lied. I saw him lie. But it was a movie, even though the actual interviews were and are available. To me, it's just astonishing how views of history can be manipulated and changed. And people are just reflecting what they were told.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, when I had Gerard Williams on, he wrote The Escape of Adolf Hitler, Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler. And it was one of those things, too, where it was just everybody tends to believe Hitler died in Argentina. I mean, in Germany. And then when you come to find out that there's some research and some good researchers and authors who looked into him making it to Argentina, and there's all these Nazi Germans that made it to Argentina, and there's no real evidence that he died in Germany, and even the FBI and the Soviets went looking for him in South America. Like it's amazing how little evidence there is in the official story that we've been told. And
well, in any great historic moment, there is quibbling over actual facts. The same thing with the JFK assassination. There are irreconcilable differences. And in Watergate, there's a series of books that focus on the original break-in, and I call them the doubter books. And there's 4 or 5 of them, and they raise very serious questions about the story that we've been told. Now, I wasn't involved, fortunately, in the break-in or in the early parts. I knew the people involved, but I wasn't personally involved. So I can't speak to whether these doubter books are true or not, but they do raise very, very interesting questions. I think Watergate, I think the Kennedy assassination, I think some other things will always be the subject of inquiry and controversy. And the only answer is to let the opinions come forward and see what they have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. The JFK assassination, you're right, is another perfect example of it, because I've done many shows on the JFK assassination. It's some with Roger Stone about the link with LBJ, Lamar Waldron, who writes a lot about the mafia influence in the JFK assassination. And then I have had Jeffrey Marley on, who talks more about the CIA, and it's like everybody kind of has their opinion on who they think is most to blame and most responsible. And like you said, even after all these years and tons of researchers and tons of books written about it, no one really agrees on who exactly did it, who gets the blame, who's involved, who's not involved, and I think like you said, all you can do is kind of put the information out there and let people kind of connect their own dots and figure it out. Same thing with Roger Stone. He wrote a book on I believe on Watergate, but people will read that book and assume that, oh, he's biased because he has a tattoo of Nixon on his back. How can he not?
Certainly
be?
Does. He certainly does.
So it's.
I wrote a review of John Dean's book that came out in 2015 called The Nixon Defense, where John tried to make the case that he has made for posterity, that reducing his role and trying to say it was open and shut that Nixon was guilty from the outset. And Roger, whom I'm in general touch with, so liked my critique that he attached it as an appendix to his book about Watergate.
Oh wow!
I mean, it was quite a compliment to my research. I bring a very, very unique perspective because I was on the inside, not only worked on the Nixon White House staff for 5 years, I was a member of the domestic council staff, that was John Ehrlichman's staff, and my policy focus, my public policy focus was law and order, crime and drugs. And so I knew all the people at the Department of Justice who came to the fore in Watergate, and I knew and worked with all the people on the White House staff. And when you get into it, most of the principal players came from one source or the other, and I knew them all. And then toward the end of the Nixon presidency, I functioned as deputy counsel to Fred Buzhardt, who was President Nixon's lead Watergate defense lawyer, and I became Fred's deputy. And in that context, I transcribed the tapes. I ran the document rooms holding the seized files. I briefed the senior staff on Watergate developments, and generally was intimately involved in the Watergate defense. Your listeners know we lost. And then after that, I discovered in about 2002, I mean, this would be 30 years later, that all of the records of the special prosecutor, at least those that survived, are kept at the National Archives. Because these people were government employees, and Mueller's records will survive too, and they'll be part of National Archives. And over time, they become public. And I've put in a lot of FOIA requests and had a lot of stuff revealed, and it shows just a tremendously interesting aspect, and that's that the special prosecutors, which were a specially recruited group of highly politicized people whose only goal was to get Richard Nixon, they wanted to bag him and his senior staff so badly they cheated. They cut corners. Prosecutors have rules of conduct that they're supposed to follow. It's not win at any cost, because they have so many advantages. But what I've been able to show, and what I've written my books about, is that the special prosecutors were meeting secretly with the judge to work out things in advance. They were not sharing exculpatory information with the defense, which is required by law and by the Supreme Court decisions. They falsely sentenced the lead government witness, John Dean, to a severe prison term with his incarceration to begin the first day of trial, and then immediately after the trial they set him free. So it was almost a fraud on the jury. And all these conversations, these secret conversations with the judges, were going on without the defense knowing. If any of these things that I've uncovered had come to light 40 years ago, the convictions would have been thrown out because the government's conduct was just outrageous. I would go just a little bit further, and then we'll talk questions. Every single thing that Mueller's critics fear, that Trump supporters fear from Mueller, actually occurred during the Watergate prosecutions, but weren't known. I mean, the dusting off of statutes that had never been enforced, the just crushing minor people in an effort to get them to conform their testimony to the prosecutor's desires, the going way afield to gather evidence, any evidence against people they didn't like. All of that was going on in Watergate. But in Watergate, there was no talk radio, there was no Fox News, there was no independent source from the media. It was a uniform media that hated Richard Nixon, if anything, more than the media hates Donald Trump today. And so Nixon's defenders and Nixon's staff didn't have a chance in the court of public opinion because only one side was presented. So I don't know anything about the Trump investigations or prosecutions, but I can tell you every time there's a worry of what may be happening behind the scenes, I can find a counterpart in what really did happen during Watergate. But it's almost 50 years ago, and people don't really want to get back into it. And so what I'm doing, what I'm spending my time doing, is documenting the record so other people, historians and researchers and scholars, at some point in the future can follow the trail that I've blazed and see the same documents I've uncovered.
Yeah. I mean, it is funny how Watergate's one of those stories that, I mean, every political scandal afterwards ends with the word gate because of Watergate, but yet there's so many people who know so little about it. And it's, I mean, I guess just for a younger listener who might heard of the term, might know the term Watergate, but don't know what exactly it is, could you give just a brief description of what the Watergate scandal was and what happened?
Watergate is the name of a office hotel complex that was built in Washington, D.C., very close to the Lincoln Memorial, and it was a huge development, and it was called Watergate. And in the office building, the Democratic National Committee rented space. I think it was the 7th floor, might have been the 8th floor, and that's where their headquarters were. And some people who were working for or on behalf of the President Nixon's re-election committee, that was called the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, it's pronounced creep, unfortunately. Some people working on behalf of or working for creep decided it would be a great idea to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters to see what they planned and what was going on. And they did. They broke in, and they were caught red-handed. And so you had a real crime, and they were tried and they were convicted they were arrested on June 17th, 1972. They're convicted in January of 1973. And then the issue became who knew? Who knew about this break-in? Who else knew about the fruits of the break-in? And was there a cover-up? And, of course, there was a cover-up. There's always a cover-up. In any bureaucracy, when something goes wrong, there's a cover-up. And the investigation turned into one of who was involved in the cover-up. So you had, in the beginning, a real crime, a break-in, and then you had a real second crime, a cover-up, which is an obstruction of justice. And the issue became who was involved. And the special prosecutor was appointed. The staff grew to 100 people. The investigations grew way wide of what was going on. And in the end, President Nixon was forced to resign, the only president to resign in history, and 24 members of his staff, members of his administration, were convicted and sent to prison. And the controversy, one we touched on earlier, is the facts surrounding the break-in are ambiguous and troubling. But the other fact that is becoming clearer and clearer in subsequent prosecutions is once prosecutors are able to show a conspiracy existed, and it's open and shut here that a conspiracy to cover up existed, the ability to add people, individuals, to that conspiracy requires almost no additional proof. It's left to what's called prosecutorial discretion. And what I maintained happened in Watergate is when the smoke cleared, the prosecutors didn't want to convict the mid-level people who were actually getting their hands dirty. They wanted to convict Nixon's top assistants. And so they alleged they were involved in the conspiracy. They let the middle-level people change their stories and say, oh, yes, they made me do it. And then the cases were tried in the District of Columbia, and these people were convicted on all counts. So you had what in retrospect is an abuse of prosecutorial discretion. And you could feel, based on the news of today, that the same thing is going on today, except there doesn't seem to be a crime in the first place. But there's all this talking heads and all this speculation. What if? What about this person? What about that person? Maybe there's obstruction of justice to an investigation where there was no crime. But the difference in Watergate is that there really was a crime, open and shut, and there really was a cover-up. It's just a question of who was involved, and the proof is just not there. That's what makes this thing so intriguing. Let me spend just a second, if I could, Ricky, and contrast Trump to Nixon, understanding that I know Nixon, and all I know about Trump I read in the newspaper.
Okay.
There are some eerie similarities. Both were change candidates, elected on promises of change in very close elections. Both came into town, were inaugurated. Nixon in '69 and Trump in 2017, opposed by every institution based in Washington, D.C. Opposed by the Congress, opposed by the congressional staff, opposed by the federal bureaucracy, opposed by the prominent law firms, opposed by the prominent think tanks, and opposed by the media. Just hated and ostracized. With Nixon, it was the liberal Eastern establishment. With Trump, it's the mainstream media. But they were both elected at a time of great divisions. In 1968, which is a year like no other, it was opposition to the Vietnam War. We had assassinations, we had riots in 19 cities, we had great universities brought to their knees, being shut down by student protests. In 2016, your listeners already know what divisions exist within the U.S. Each president, though, had amazing successes early in their term. And it's really, Nixon had these foreign affairs successes in his first term, the opening of China, Soviet detente, ending the Vietnam War, geopolitics in the Middle East, return of the POWs, the prisoners of war. And Trump has had great successes, the Supreme Court appointments, the tax bill. It's surprising, given the divisive nature of the electorate, that both presidents had successes. Now, there are differences, of course, between the two men Nixon was a career politician, lifelong politician. Trump clearly is not. In Nixon's era, the Democrats firmly controlled the Congress. It was a 2/3 majority. Here I told you that Trump didn't control the Congress. If you add in the never-Trumpers and the Republican elites, in the first 2 years, the Republicans had very, very narrow nominal majorities, but Trump didn't. Trump didn't have a set of senators he could count on, 0 Democrats and just enough renegade Republicans to thwart many of his initiatives. And the same thing happened in the House. It's just the House is always an unruly bunch of people, hundreds of them, each with different interests. The other thing, and of course we already explained, in Nixon's era there was a monolithic media. So there were 3 networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. There were 2 influential newspapers. The only national newspaper was the New York Times. The Washington Post dominates the District of Columbia. Everybody reads the Washington Post. That sets the structure for daily conversations. And there were 2 national weeklies, 2 news magazines that supplied opinion and analysis. Pretty much, the newspapers were presenting facts, and reporters didn't get to sign their news reports, because before Woodward and Bernstein, the news was expected to be unbiased. The news was expected to be more like a chronology. Here's what happened. And ever since Watergate, the news has become, here's what I think you should think about what happened today. And that's put on the front page as though it were news. The other thing, and then this is the end of my list, that's a dramatic difference between Trump and Nixon, is that in retrospect, Nixon played by the establishment's rules. He went quietly into the night after his presidency had been totally ruined. It's not at all clear that President Trump is going to play by the establishment's rules. The establishment isn't, and Trump feels, I think, under no obligation to just go along with this incredible effort to deny him the legitimacy of his election.
Yeah, there's absolutely similarities, and it does seem like, similar to Watergate, there's going to be a lot of debate on what's actually going on as we speak. Is there anything actually illegal going on, or is it just, like you said, rhetoric? Is it just, I mean, it's amazing. We've briefly on the show talked about Russiagate a few times, and there's not much to talk about because there's not really anything there. If there was, it would be public. It would be front page news.
You've got an effort underway to convince the American public, a successful effort of about half the American public, that talking to Russia is a crime. And everybody talked to Russia before and after the election. It would be standard practice for a newly elected administration to talk to all kinds of foreign governments. But somehow this has become, oh, no, that's collusion. And you sit there and you say, wow, if that's collusion, why aren't we investigating these other events? Why do we suddenly decide for this guy at this time that's wrong? And what is different today is you've got talking heads, opinion makers and analysts on both sides. In the Watergate era, it was all one side. Nixon's defenders never got coverage, so the American public only saw one aspect. You talk to the older generation, people who were born, say, before 1953 or so. So at least they'd be in high school during Watergate. Their memories and knowledge of the Watergate investigation comes from the Ervin Committee, the Senate select committee that held hearings on Watergate. But that wasn't a courtroom. Nixon had essentially no defenders on the Republican side of that committee, and the media was having an absolute field day excerpting testimony from people, which was leaked beforehand and commented upon afterwards. So if that's your knowledge, you have a one-sided view of what was going on in Watergate. And behind the scenes, there's a whole different story of what Nixon's people did or didn't do, and what was going on within the investigation.
Yeah, and nobody brings up the Uranium One deal and how Hillary was a part of selling tons of uranium to Russia, and all that stuff, and obviously the Clinton Foundation and how they're basically out of business because of all the deals that they were doing, and now how they have very little political. You
get the impression only one side gets investigated, and of course that was true in Watergate. Only one side was going to be investigated. The Ervin Committee had 2 party line votes. Now, remember, the Democrats control 2/3 of the Senate, so 2 party line votes in establishing the Ervin Committee. And the first vote was they would only investigate presidential elections. They wouldn't investigate cheating or conniving in senatorial or House elections. And the only presidential election they would investigate would be 1962. Now, this is significant because there was huge wrongdoing in the 68 election, in the 64 election, and in the 1960 election. And the wrongdoing was done by Democrats. But they majestically voted that they wouldn't go investigate that. They would only investigate Richard Nixon. So from the very outset, the fix was in with the Ervin Committee.
Now, I mean, to be the devil's advocate, some of the people who got caught, they were part of Operation 40, Nixon's approved operation to attempt to assassinate Castro. Some of these people were obviously, if you do JFK assassination research, names like E. Howard Hunt's going to pop up. And then also, there's some people who talk about the link to the committee to reelect the president and some.
Oh, without question. But go back a second, and you got to remember, I'm a domestic guy. Yeah. I don't do foreign affairs. But you've suggested that Nixon's plot was to assassinate Castro. I thought those plots came to fruition under Jack Kennedy. When Nixon left office, I believe there were the start of plans to invade Cuba, to train and arm the Cuban patriots, which culminated in the Bay of Pigs disaster. But that occurred under Jack Kennedy, when Jack Kennedy denied the invading force any air cover. So I don't think you can lay the Cuban difficulties at Nixon's feet.
I think it was actually approved by Dwight Eisenhower in 19.
Oh, I'm sure the planning. No, I'm sure the planning was.
And then Nixon was vice president.
And we have to be very specific here. And again, I could be wrong. The sending of people in, the quiet efforts to assassinate Fidel before the invasion, the connection with the mob to say, here, go poison his soup or give him an exploding cigar. I think all of that stuff occurred that we know of occurred under Kennedy.
Yeah, I don't think
that I've ever read anything about an actual attempt. Now, it's entirely possible there was planning, there was thought. That's the Pentagon and the CIA's job. I'm sure it may be embarrassing to say so. I'm sure there are papers written about what to do about Venezuela right now. Contingency planning That's going to go on. But actual putting stuff into effect, I don't think it's ever been shown under Eisenhower or Nixon. I mean, same administration. I think the actual efforts, the operational aspects, started under Jack Kennedy.
Yeah, I know.
But regardless,
regardless,
the Cubans had huge respect for Eduardo, the mysterious figure that turned out to be E. Howard Hunt, and he went down to Miami and he recruited Cuban patriots to do two break-ins. The first one was in 1971 and was the break-in into Daniel Ellsberg's shrink's office, done by the plumbers operation at the White House. And then the second break-in was the Watergate break-in, and back to your people who have the benefit of not being alive at the time. The people who were caught red-handed in the office of the Democratic National Committee were 4 Cuban Americans and a guy named James McCord, who was a retired CIA wiretapping expert, who was employed by the president's re-election committee as their head of security. And so what you had, people caught red-handed, you had one employee of CREEP, and you had 4 Cuban Americans whose hotel room across the street from the Watergate office building contained an address book with a White House phone number and the initials HH for Howard Hunt, and uncirculated, crisp, serially numbered $100 bills. I think it was a total of about $5,000, and that money was easily traced to the president's re-election committee. So there's no question from day one, the president's re-election committee was in real trouble from the Watergate arrests. And that's when the cover-up began, very clearly a cover-up. And the 2 people who were indicted as having been the organizers and supervisors of the break-in, they were not within the office building, but they were certainly nearby during the break-in, were Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. And Gordon Liddy, real name is G. Gordon Liddy, was a retired FBI agent who had been an assistant district attorney in Dutchess County, New York, and he was at the time the lawyer for the finance committee of the president's re-election. And he had gone over, his first job was counsel for the whole committee, the whole re-election committee, and then that was reduced to being counsel for the finance committee. And he was also in charge of having authored and then executed what's called a campaign intelligence plan. And then E. Howard Hunt was a retired CIA career officer, and when he was the secretive Eduardo during the invasion of Cuba, he was working a full-time employee of the CIA. So you had these 2 guys. He was a consultant to the committee to re-elect the president. You had these 2 guys, one a former FBI agent, one a former CIA operative, who were advising and supervising the break-in. This is a huge scandal. And then the issue became, and then you get into the cover-up part. Those were the 7 people who were indicted for the break-in itself. Then there was an investigation to find out who else knew? Who sent these people in? Who was Gordon Liddy reporting to within the committee to reelect the president? And did the problem begin and end at the reelection committee? You have to picture physically the headquarters of the reelection committee was kitty-cornered across the street from the White House itself. Its headquarters were 1701 Pennsylvania Avenue. But the larger question, was anybody on the White House staff itself knowledgeable about this intended break-in? And that's where the things got really interesting, and where you have today great ambiguities about who was involved and who knew, and how much they knew. Because the great phrase from the Irvin Committee, the great question from the hearings of the Irvin Committee was articulated by Howard Baker, who was the lead Republican. And he said at one point, isn't the question, what did the president know and when did he know it? And I think that's a very valid question. And it's, I think, something that's still subject of considerable debate. I think in light of what I've uncovered, you could make a strong case that the president acted in a most appropriate manner, even though there are snippets on the tapes that others have said suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, there are also the Nixon tapes. I mean, isn't there a part where he says that Watergate was a huge hoax? It was America's biggest hoax, and there, he won. And you talk about it being a huge cover up, but the weird thing about it is, when you research Watergate, one thing you constantly run into is how small of a story it was at the time initially. So it was a break-in. Nobody seemed to really care that much initially, and then he won. He won the election soon after for his second term in a landslide. Greatest landslide in the nation's history. The only state he didn't win is the one that that I live in, is Massachusetts, and the district. Yeah,
he didn't carry the district either. But other than that, he carried 49 states. The biggest electoral landslide in the nation's history. He had a very successful first year, but starting in the beginning of the second term, it was a long, slow highway to disaster with leaks and developments. Yes, the public didn't seem to care about the Watergate break-in. It was originally dismissed as a third-rate burglary. There were people who worked for the reelection committee who did stuff they shouldn't have done. No question about that. But the question was, and it grew and it grew and it grew, who knew? And of course, the lead guy running the cover-up, John Dean, who has admitted publicly that he was chief desk officer for the cover-up, when it
No, did I lose you?
Was illegal. John Dean switched sides, and he switched his story. And he started saying, I was just an innocent guy. These superiors, they made me do it. And, of course, the prosecutors wanted to convict the more significant people, and the jurors in the District of Columbia were raised to hate Nixon anyway. I mean, even in this nationwide landslide re-election in 1972, Nixon lost the District of Columbia. There was an 80% vote against him. So the jury pool within the district was dramatic.
No, did I lose you again?
It was before all the adverse news. Now, hurry to today, just for a second. If there are trials in the Trump situation, they will be tried in the district. That's where the crimes or the obstruction and the other things that Mueller may come up with would have occurred. And so you ask yourself, well, what is the predilection of voters in the District of Columbia? Because the jury pool comes from the list of registered voters. So the pool is drawn from registered voters. How did they vote in 2016 when Trump won? And what you find is scary if you are indicted as somebody involved in a crime involved or connected with the Trump administration, because President Trump won 4% of the vote in the District of Columbia. So you have a huge taint or bias, a political bias, in the jury pool against Trump people. Nixon's people had the same situation. Numbers were a little bit less, but they didn't stand a chance in front of a D.C. jury.
Now, when is it true that Watergate was actually already bugged and they were there to just fix or replace?
Well, it's close. There were 2 break-ins. The first break-in occurred on May 28th, and they weren't caught. And I think there was one guy difference, but it was roughly the same team went in. And what most people believe is they planted 2 bugging devices, and they took some pictures of some records, and they sought to plant a wiretap on Larry O'Brien's phone, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee, and on a phone outside of Spencer Oliver's office in the desk of a lady named Mary Wells, and there was a bug placed there. And this is conventional wisdom. I'm not saying this is true. This is what we've been told. And then the bug for Larry O'Brien's didn't work. And so the team was sent back in on June 17th to fix the bug, and that's when they were caught. And so one of the stories is the people at the re-election committee had the fruits of the one wiretap that worked, and that those fruits were available to them. So, of course, the prosecutor said, okay, anybody who knew about this, anybody who saw the fruits of those wiretaps, we're going after them, because they got the benefit of the wiretaps, and they knew, and they didn't say a word, and that makes them guilty as they can be. Big investigation over who knew. I was I was on the White House staff throughout, but not involved in the campaign, so I never once set foot in the re-election committee's headquarters and didn't communicate with people who were over there, most of whom were transferred from the White House staff to go over to be involved in the campaign. But I wasn't involved in the 1968 campaign. I was in law school, so there was no reason for me to have any expertise or knowledge for the 1972 campaign. And the domestic council, which employed me while I was part of the White House, had a separate payroll like the National Security Council, and we were hatched. So that's a federal law that says you can't accept federal money and be involved in a campaign. You can't be a federal employee and be involved in the campaign. So I wasn't connected at all with the 68 campaign, and I was never connected with the 72 campaign. But others that were, there was a huge investigation of those people to try to figure out who knew, because there had been a wiretap put in place from May 28th to at least June 17th. Now, then you get into these doubter books, and I find them fascinating. And it starts with Fred Thompson's book. Fred is a famous actor and later a United States Senator from Tennessee. But when he was a kid, he was United States Attorney for the Middle District of Tennessee, and he had run Howard Baker's re-election campaign. Howard Baker's a very prominent Republican whose father-in-law was Everett Dirksen. It's a Republican family that goes way back. And he was the ranking member of the Senate Ervin Committee that did the Watergate investigation. And for reasons that are lost in the sands of time, he hired as the head minority counsel Fred Thompson from Tennessee, who'd really never been in Washington before. So the first thing you learn about the Ervin Committee is we didn't have any good staff people on the Republican side. We had a nice guy, but he didn't even know where the men's room was in the nation's capital. And then after the Ervin Committee was over, Fred writes a book, and the book is called At That Point in Time. And he describes all of these efforts that they tried to help Nixon, to present another side of Watergate that somehow didn't come to fruition. That they tried to learn about what the CIA's involvement was, but senior senators, Republicans on the Senate Intelligence Committee came over and told Howard Baker, don't go there. Do not investigate the CIA. So they didn't. And they had a guy named Russell who was going to testify about very peculiar aspects about the Democratic National Committee. And the guy had a heart attack the night before he was due to testify. And he was a guy kind of on the shadowy side of the CIA. So Fred's book says, we tried all these things and they didn't work. And then after that, I don't have the date right in front of me, but I think it was about 1984 or 85, Jim Hogan came out with a book called Secret Agenda. And Hogan's point, really interesting. I can't tell you what's true or not. I just don't know. But he says, look, they couldn't find any bugs. You're told there was bugging devices, but the only bugs they found were in James McCord's briefcase. There were no bugs on the phones. And there's a memo written by the early investigator, the member of the United States Attorney's Office that did the original investigation, to the FBI that says, how can we prosecute for wiretaps when there are no wiretaps? And so if you start out with that there were no wiretaps in place, who were the Republican, the committee to reelect? Who were they listening to? What were they overhearing between May 28th and June 17th? This gets very complicated, Ricky, but allegation is that the CIA was running a honey trap, catching foreign dignitaries in compromising situations with ladies of the night, with prostitutes, and that honey trap was run at the office Columbia Plaza, which is next door to the Watergate office building, and that the Democratic National Committee, the guy who was in charge of field operations, a guy named Spencer Oliver, that when people would come in from the field, Democratic I
lost you.
They were looking for a good time while they were in Washington, D.C., he would set them up with this same set of prostitutes that were run out of the building next door. And that's what the wiretap was picking up. If there was a wiretap, it was picking up Democratic National Committee individuals setting up assignations with ladies of the night next door, and nothing else.
So
interestingly, and then I'll stop this particular part on Hogan's book, interestingly, there's still litigation over that. They have the memos written from those, supposedly from those wiretaps, and there have been court efforts to have them unsealed, and this mysterious lawyer shows up and says, wait a second, these people are illegally overheard, and if you release the tapes of them being illegally overheard, you're punishing them for being the target of an illegal act. You can't release these notes from these wiretaps, and the courts have held yes, that's right. So the fruits of those wiretaps are still sealed. So Hogan in his book goes on to point out that every single person involved in the Watergate break-in, the burglars and the supervisors, except Gordon Liddy, have CIA connections. They were either full-time or they were involved in the Cuban invasion. And here Gordon Liddy thinks he's running the break-in. And Hogan's point is he wasn't running the break-in was running him. Because all these other people were CIA. The CIA knew this was happening. They didn't like Richard Nixon, and they let it go. In fact, they may have helped set it up for these people to be caught, because James McCord, who's the wire expert, who's the former full-time CIA guy, James McCord's whereabouts on the night of the break-in have huge gaps. And it looks to Jim Hogan as though he deliberately botched the break-in so people would be caught. He was supposed to be off the floor before the police got there, and he didn't mean to get caught himself, but his actions can be interpreted as deliberately botching the break-in. So that's Hogan's book, Secret Agenda.
Now, what?
I'm going to go on to Len Kolodny's if we have a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because these are fun books to read. If you're a conspiracy buff, this is big stuff. Kolodny's book comes out in about 1994, I think. It's early 1990s. And it consists of two parts. It's called Silent Coup, the Removal of a President. And there are really three parts to the book, but part one and part three key off of a military spy ring that was going on in the White House spying on President Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And that's actually true. There really was a military spy ring. The military felt, or some people in the military, felt that Nixon was committing treason, that he and his crazy liberal professor, Henry Kissinger from Harvard, were talking to our mortal enemies, holding secret talks with China and secret talks with Russia, and the President of the United States was visiting both of these countries, and he was announcing troop withdrawals from Vietnam that the military hadn't consented to. So they set up a spy ring to figure out what on earth Kissinger and Nixon and the National Security Council were up to. And we know that there was a guy named Admiral Wellender, and he was running it, and he had a yeoman. They had male secretaries in the military, and Yeoman Redford was the guy gathering secret materials. The one allegation is that he photocopied 5,000 documents and improperly forwarded them back to the military, back at the Pentagon. And so that's part of Len Kolodny's book. Then in the middle of Len's book, part two is called Golden Boy, and that's the story of John Dean. And Len really takes off after Dean, and the allegation, roughly, is that Dean was dating a girl whom he later married, Maureen Biner, and that Dean's worry was that Maureen might have been a party girl before they met, and might have been involved or connected in some way with this honey trap that the CIA was running at the Columbia Plaza Hotel, which wasn't a groundless fear, because Mo's roommate, Heidi Reichen, was the madam running the honeypot. So the allegation is that he sent the team back in to try to be sure there was no mention or proof of Mo Biner's involvement at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Now, that particular section, part two, is kind of inserted in the middle of Len's book. I mean, it is really out of context with parts 1 and 3. But then there's a second book called White House Call Girl that comes out in the 2010s about that picks up on the story of Heidi Reichen. And they found her black book, and they got all these interesting people who are named in the black book. And then there's a book coming out next year by Ray Locker that's called Haig's Coup, and that's really the continuation of Len's book about the military spy ring. Because I haven't read it, but I'm pretty confident of what it's going to say. It's going to say that Alexander Haig was knowledgeable of and a recipient of some of these papers that were being illegally photocopied and removed by Admiral Wellander and Yeoman Radford. So you've got a series of books, and the common is everything you've been told about Watergate isn't correct, particularly in connection with the break-in. Now, I too have a conspiracy book. My conspiracy book comes out in 2008. And it isn't about the break-in, it's about the prosecutions, the investigation and prosecutions of Watergate. And my conspiracy says, look, this was all orchestrated by Kennedy people who wanted Ted Kennedy to be to run and win election to the presidency in 1976 so they could in power. And if you don't mind, I'll take just a couple of minutes on the theme of that book, and then we can go on.
Yeah, absolutely.
When Jack Kennedy was elected in 1960, he brought with him to Washington hundreds, if not thousands, of supporters who really weren't involved in politics before. These were the kids from the prep schools and the Ivy League colleges and universities who would normally go work someplace else, but with Jack Kennedy, they came to Washington, and it was fun. And we remember that, or they remember that era as Camelot. We're the best and the brightest. We're going to come down to Washington and take charge. Well, their moment in the sun, their fun in being in positions of power in the federal government, snatched from them improperly by Jack Kennedy's assassination. He was hardly in office 1,000 days, and suddenly he was gone. And what they were disappointed in was that his younger brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was clearly the second most powerful person in Washington, didn't accede to the presidency. Instead, the vice president became president, Lyndon Johnson, this corn-toned redneck from Texas who could hardly read. And so these elitists were suddenly out of power. And they longed for a return to power. Bobby Kennedy. And their original hope was that Lyndon Johnson would name Bobby to be his vice presidential running mate in 1964, and Humphrey didn't do it. Johnson didn't do it. He named Hubert Humphrey. So then, if you remember, Bobby Kennedy leaves Washington and runs for the Senate, gets elected from New York, and then the hope was that Bobby Kennedy would run for president in 1968, that he would challenge Johnson, because Johnson could have run for re-election in 1968, and then Johnson dropped out, and Bobby announced he was going to run, and everybody thought, happy days are here again, we're going to be back in power, and Bobby got assassinated right after winning the California primary. He was on his way to being the Democratic candidate. So they're left with the only Kennedy brother who's still alive, Teddy Kennedy. And Teddy, he's 14 years younger than Robert Kennedy. He's not the same person his brothers were. And he gets involved in Chappaquiddick, and where poor Mary Jo Quebecny dies. But their thought was, only if Teddy Kennedy is back in the Oval Office do we come back to power. So what my book does is it traces everything that went on
I'm losing you.
In the special prosecutor's office, everything went on in the House impeachment inquiry, and the leadership is all Kennedy people all the time, and that their main motivation was not to destroy Nixon. That was kind of a byproduct, not to destroy the Republican Party, except as a way of opening the path for a very damaged candidate, Teddy Kennedy, to become president. So those are the conspiracy books. They're fun. They're fun to read. You just don't know. I mean, they're based on fact. The CIA did know very clearly, knew about the intended break-in. The military really was spying on Richard Nixon, and Jack Kennedy's administration people really wanted Teddy to be elected in 1976. So you take these wisps of truth, and you can weave them into fascinating tales.
Now, I mean, one thing you always have to look at is motive. And like you said, Nixon did win in a landslide. He didn't seem like he had much, he would have much motive to do something as...
but let me tell you, yes, but that's not true.
Okay. Because I really want to get into, possibly his motive, and
sure,
also people like Surges and Hunt. I mean, these guys are ex-CIA guys.
Right.
I mean, some of them, these guys are linked to the JFK assassination. I mean, these guys don't seem like they have... do they have an ideology that's motivating them? Are they who's paying them? Who's even their
well, let me start. Let me start. This is speculation, but
of course,
I think it's knowledgeable. I think it's knowledgeable speculation because I was there. Dick Nixon felt, with good reason, that the 1960 election was stolen from him by the Kennedy people. You remember the Dick Daley in Chicago, the dead people voted and they barely took Illinois, and there's the same degree of cheating in Texas. So Nixon may well have won the election in 1960, and it was stolen from him. His office, when he was first elected to Congress in 1946, his office was across the hall from Jack Kennedy's, and they were actually friends. But he was very, very bitter about the election being stolen and being demeaned. You have to remember that Dick Nixon was not handsome, he was not wealthy, and he was not a graduate of an Ivy League school. Jack Kennedy was everything Dick Nixon was not.
And he was kind of a reserved person too, right? He didn't like confrontation.
Nixon was a classic introvert.
Yeah, didn't like confrontation.
Kennedy was a playboy. Jack Kennedy, he was in the Senate. I mean, he had a Secretary Evelyn Lincoln who lined up different dates every night. He was party all the time. And Dick Nixon really believed, going into the 1960 election, he was the better man. He may not have been handsome or the best speech giver, but he worked hard and he was very knowledgeable. And if you took away television and photographs of Jack Kennedy on his sailboat with his lovely wife, Dick Nixon was the better prepared person to be president. But he lost.
Well, didn't some people talk about how the televised debate, how people thought Kennedy won, and then people who heard it on the radio thought Nixon won? And
absolutely, that's conventional wisdom. That in the first debate, which was the most important debate, which was the first televised debate in our history, that Dick Nixon, who was a champion debater in college, won on points. He really did respond to the questions, and he really did have the facts at his fingertips. And if you heard it on the radio, most people said he won. But if you watched it on TV, the handsome, articulate Jack Kennedy looked off into the distance, into the TV, and said, "We can do better. join me. We can do better. Let's get America moving again. And he invented this, quote, missile gap, that we were behind the Soviets, which was wrong. Both Jack Kennedy and Richard Nixon got CIA briefings, and he knew that it wasn't true, but Nixon was prevented as vice president from revealing the true factual background. So he got tagged with having been part of an administration that somehow had allowed us to slip behind the Russians. And you remember at the time the Russians put their satellite into space before we did.
Sputnik, yeah.
It went up in 1958, the size of a basketball, but it beat us. So there was great concern that we were behind. And the Kennedy people played on that beautifully, and Nixon lost. Well, from then going forward, Nixon was terrified of the Kennedys coming back in and beating him. He was going to have to run against Bobby, and nobody thought he stood a chance. And then there were all kinds of articles after Nixon was elected that he would be a one-term president, that the guy to take him out in 19... And it was just a foregone conclusion because Teddy was a Kennedy. And he had all the media and all the glitter crowd with him. Well, then Chappaquiddick occurred, and Teddy couldn't run in 1972, but was ready to run in 1976. Nixon knew it, and Nixon thought, you go back early, they're getting ready to run for re-election. So it's December of 1971, or October, November, the fall of 1971, the Nixon people have made the decision they're not going to run the re-election campaign out of the White House itself. They're going to set up a separate committee. And ultimately, John Mitchell is going to come back.
Hello?
He's going to run the re-election campaign because he ran the 68 campaign. And the other guys are going to stay involved in running the government itself. So they start to put the pieces together for their re-election campaign. Remember, they call it CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. And Nixon's fear, it's on the tapes, it's very clear, was that Teddy Kennedy would skip the primaries, show up at the convention, and be nominated by acclamation. So all of his background on fooling around with women, on killing poor Mary Jo Kopechne, on being arrested for driving under the influence, University of Virginia Law School, all of that stuff would be skipped because his background would not become the subject of scrutiny during the primary season. And in that era, in 1972, there weren't all that many primaries. So the fear, Nixon was genuinely paranoid about the Kennedys. They had stolen the presidency from him once. He didn't want it stolen again. McGovern was not yet on the radar. Even Hubert Humphrey, whom Nixon had defeated in 68, he had not withdrawn from contention in 1972. So this attitude that, Nixon didn't have a worry in the world, why on earth would he do this? This didn't matter. Very worried about Teddy Kennedy. Nixon's people, therefore, were very worried.
Well,
now,
he was also very
for a second.
very paranoid, right? I mean, he
was paranoid anyway. Even paranoids have enemies, and Dick Nixon had lifelong enemies of the entire liberal Eastern establishment. They hated him. They hated him more intensely than people today hate Donald Trump. Nixon was a warmonger. They somehow, remember when Nixon is inaugurated in January of 1969, Lyndon Johnson has placed 535,000 United States troops in Vietnam. Roll that number around in your mind for a second, Ricky. 537,000 American troops in Vietnam, dying. Ultimately, 50,000 people lost their lives. People my age, this is born between 1942 and 1953 or 54, a 10-year period, subject to the draft. Everybody was going to go. If you got drafted, you were going to go to Vietnam, and if you went to Vietnam, you were going to die. And the resistance from the students, from the people who were worried about the draft, and from their families and their supporters, and from the academics, was incredible, because they had convinced themselves they were going to die. And Nixon comes into office, 537,000 troops, and he starts removing them. He starts winding down the war. He starts saying, look, we gotta have the Vietnamese defend their country. This isn't our problem. This is their problem. We'll train them, we'll equip them, but they got to fight. But he didn't do it the next day. It took him 3 or 4 years to wind down. So the opposition said it's his war. Pat Moynihan, Pat is a Harvard professor, very liberal, is one of the first counselors to President Nixon. Later, he becomes our ambassador to the United Nations and then a very prominent senator from New York. But in the beginning, he comes to Washington as part of the Nixon administration. And he tells Nixon, he says, the people don't think of this as your war. But if you don't end it or do something dramatic within the first 6 months, it's going to be your war. And they'll make you have it. Now, we have a modern-day equivalent with Obamacare. Okay? Obamacare is a Democratic invention. It was a mess-up, a huge mistake. The Republicans proved themselves unable to repeal it. So now it's seen as the Republicans' problem. The Democrats are campaigning on the idea the Republicans messed up health care. And the media supports them, and the American public seems to have forgotten. Well, the same thing happened with Vietnam. The American public decided it was Nixon's war. So it was not a popular time for him to be president.
Yeah, that's well, I mean, he also was, one of his political consultants was Henry Kissinger, who has
absolutely,
which didn't help.
He comes in. What is so interesting about Richard Nixon? He's been a congressman, been a senator, been vice president for 8 years. Then he loses. He spends 8 years in the wilderness, thinking about what he would do if he ever became president. He gets elected. First 3 people he brings as his counselors, closest to him, are 3 people with dramatically different philosophies who did not support his election. Pat Moynihan is a very liberal Harvard professor who has strong ideas about family and poverty and how to redo housing. Henry Kissinger is an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller who opposed Nixon's election. A professor and supposedly knowledge in foreign affairs, brilliant guy, but not a Nixon supporter. And Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns is president of Columbia University, a classic conservative. And Nixon wasn't a classic conservative. He was, if you were kind to him, you would call him a pragmatist. He's elected in an era when people still thought the government could solve problems, could address problems and be a force for good. And Nixon's role as president is to solve or to address problems. We all know of his foreign affairs triumphs, and they really are triumphs. The opening of China, détente and the SALT Treaty with the Soviet Union, winding down the Vietnam War, bringing home the prisoners of war, and reasserting American influence in the Middle East. Dramatic changes. But his domestic accomplishments are equally dramatic, if unappreciated. He creates the Environmental Protection Agency. He passes clean air, clean water, marine mammals, anti-ocean dumping. He restores the rights of Native Americans. He does away with the draft. He works and supports the 18-year-old vote. He achieves the peaceful integration of the Southern schools and the imposition of the Philadelphia Plan for integrating the Northern trade unions. He quadruples the number of women appointed to high government office. We didn't use this phrase at the time, but what he really did was look out across the landscape and say, okay, who's got a legitimate complaint? Who isn't being treated fairly? Okay, your schools aren't integrated. We'll deal with that. Women aren't being given openings. We'll deal with that. The Native Indians don't have the rights that we gave them by treaty. We'll deal with that. Just right across the stage, and the phrase we use today is the pursuit of a just society. That's really the proper characterization of Nixon's domestic policy. And, of course, his foreign policy is summarized by his advocates, understand, is summarized as the golden age of diplomacy, when the United States stood aside the entire world as the only respected nation with whom you could negotiate diplomatic agreements. So Nixon had a huge first term, even though he was worried about being reelected because he was worried about Kennedy popping up. So his people were worried about that. And then you had these crazy people. I think Gordon Liddy is a random force that shouldn't have been there. He decides in his campaign intelligence plan that it would be really beneficial to bug the opposition. And apparently what it never occurred to him was what was going to happen if they got caught, and they got caught.
No.
And Nixon is on the tapes is saying, what was going through these people's minds? You know, did they think we were going to call up the Attorney General and get them off? You know? Yeah. I mean, it's been 50 years since Watergate, Ricky, and it's never been shown that Nixon or Haldeman or Ehrlichman or anybody on the White House staff knew in advance of the break-in, with the possible exception of John Dean. John Dean, a convicted felon, a man sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison for his leadership role in the cover-up, a man who's been disbarred from the practice of law for 40 years. He's touted by today's media as a hero of Watergate. He's the one, and he says it on the tape when he goes in to see the president. He says, this all started when I was asked to put together a perfectly legitimate campaign intelligence plan. And then he talks about recruiting Gordon Liddy. John Dean recruited and hired Gordon Liddy. John Dean worked with him and discussed with him different aspects of the plan and basically gave Liddy the impression he could have $1 million for his campaign intelligence plan. So Gordon Liddy, retired FBI agent, former assistant district attorney of Dutchess County, New York, comes up with a plan that is incredible. This is the product of a criminal mind. His plan, and it's best described in James Rosen's book about John Mitchell, called The Strongman. His plan includes aspects of mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. And I'm not making those things up. It's really there. And he goes, plan. And one of the great ironies of Watergate, you know, how did thing? He shows up as the lawyer for the re-election committee, shows up over across the street at 1701 Pennsylvania Avenue, telling people he's been promised $1 million. $1 million to spend on his plan. And the guy who's acting chief of staff he's really a place warmer. I mean, the people who were sent were people whose jobs in the administration weren't all that important, so they could be spared to kind of set up shop for the reelection committee. This is a gentleman named Jeb Magruder. He says, when Dean shows up, he says, well, shoot, the only person who possibly approve of a $1 million expenditure is John Mitchell. And he's not even here yet. He's going to come take over the campaign, but he's still Attorney General. He can't come.
Now,
so they arrange a meeting with John Mitchell. Magruder says, we got to go over and see John, even though he's still Attorney General of the United States. And who goes to this meeting? Gordon Liddy, who's written up the plan, John Dean, who's recruited him and hired him to develop the plan, Jeb Magruder, who's the nominally in charge of the reelection committee, and John Mitchell. It's his office. And Liddy presents these charts, and the charts are prepared by the CIA. He got the CIA to make the charts for him, laying out this incredible plan. And they reject it. And Liddy bitches on the way home in the car, says, you guys didn't support me. And then they said, well, why don't you calm it down, trim it, and so he comes back, and he's got a plan that costs $500,000. And Mitchell won't even meet with him. Magruder can't get a meeting with Mitchell. So he calls on John Dean to call Mitchell to schedule the meeting. It occurs on February 4th. 6 days later, the meeting is $500,000. Mugging, kidnapping, and prostitution are now off the table, but bugging is clearly a part of it. And once again, the plan doesn't get approved. The meeting evolves into nothing. John Dean says, I told the people this plan shouldn't even be discussed in the Attorney General's office. Well, people say, well, that's because John Dean was against the plan. That's not true. What he meant was Mitchell has to have plausible deniability. We've got to put this plan together without higher-ups' approval, because if something goes wrong, they got to be able to deny any knowledge. So the second meeting ends with no approvals. And then you get down to the third meeting where it is alleged the plan was approved by Mitchell. This is March 30th, 1972. He's in Miami. They have a meeting. Jeb Magruder comes down with 30 items that need Mitchell's decision. And this is the last one on the list. And there are three people in the room. There's John Mitchell, there's Jeb Magruder, and there's a Mitchell aide named Fred LaRue. Fred LaRue figures quite prominently throughout Watergate. And this comes up, and now the proposal is down to $250,000. And two people in the room, John Mitchell and Fred LaRue, later testified they didn't approve it. Mitchell said, I don't want to hear about this again. Magruder testifies, oh no, he approved it. And so we started executing that plan. We gave money to Liddy, and then 5 weeks later, they got caught. But interestingly enough, in the trial where Mitchell is indicted and prosecuted for approving this plan, he spends half his time trying to prove that he didn't approve the plan. And it really, once you get into it and you look at the trial and you look at the testimony, you say, wow, he really has a point. Because everything that Magruder said, he never used Mitchell's name. He comes out and he says, this has been approved. Or the higher-ups have said we're going to go forward. Or the big enchilada has given us the green light. But he never uses Mitchell's name. And it turns out Magruder was giving money to Liddy to execute the plan before he even went down to that last meeting. So once again, you get back into the facts not supporting the overall theory. In any event, it's not surprising that Nixon was worried about the 72 election, that his people were going to run a very, very aggressive reelection campaign, and that some people went way over the line in their proposals, I think without authority. I was, one personal story, and then I'll pause. I was over talking to Pat Moynihan as Watergate was coming down around us. Pat was now ambassador to India, and I was there for some international drug conference or something, and went over and had dinner with Pat that I had known from his White House days. And we were bemoaning what was happening back in Washington. And he said, Geoff, you know, this is an interesting business that we're in, this political business, because campaigns attract crazy people on both sides. And the ramifications from winning are so great as distinguished from the utter loss of losing that some people go way over their line in trying to win. And we can't keep them out because we keep accepting and recruiting volunteers in our campaigns. The issue, Geoff, is what you do when you first realize that you have a nut on your side. And that is where we failed. And I think that's very true. I think when it became clear that Liddy was way over in his proposals, we didn't throw him out. We didn't fire him. We humored him. And when it was discovered that it was his team that was caught, that he was responsible for this break-in, we didn't clean house. And we didn't clean house because the guy who was most at risk of prosecution, John Dean, who had been in the meetings, who had recruited Gordon Liddy, he ended up in charge of, as the lawyer, responsible for protecting the White House during the Watergate investigation. John Dean had a huge conflict of interest. Nobody knew about it. So he should never have been running the cover-up, never have been protecting the White House's interests. Remember, at the beginning of the Watergate investigation, nobody from the White House is at risk. It's all people from the reelection campaign. Bad as that is, nothing is wrong with the White House staff itself. We could have walked clean, but for John Dean.
Well, what's your speaking of Mitchell? What's your opinion on Martha Mitchell? I know there's a as you probably know, the psychiatrists even use a term now called the Martha Mitchell effect about saying something that seems delusional at first, but eventually turns out to be true.
Well,
what's your opinion on her story?
Well, here's John Mitchell, a taciturn kind of guy, not a public figure, hugely successful, is running a very prominent Wall Street firm, and he's a bond lawyer. John Mitchell is best known is in his professional career for inventing what's called the moral obligation bond. You don't know this, but before John Mitchell, before a government entity, a school district or a city or a state could issue bonds, could go into debt, the voters had to approve of the bond issue because you were going to pledge future tax revenues to pay off the bonds. And the public didn't like the idea of going into debt. So they kept losing all these votes. And John came up with this idea that you could say, well, Orange County didn't really pledge bond, but we can sell the bond because they have a moral obligation to pay. So
no, I'm losing it.
The need for public approval, for voter approval. Well, I mean, they would write opinions saying these are good bonds. And he was massively successful, and his firm was writing opinions on bond issues all across the country. He works very hard. You know, the laws of jealous mistress. He loses his first wife. He remarries Martha Mitchell. She's a flamboyant Southern belle with no fear at all, very outspoken in her Southern drawl, and attractive. And she was trouble from day one.
She liked to party.
And he wasn't. She loved to party and she loved to drink. He wasn't going to come to the administration after he had run the campaign that elected Dick Nixon. Dick is a law partner. Mitchell had the presence and the authority to tell Richard Nixon, don't do that. And Richard Nixon delegated the campaign part to John Mitchell, and he won. See, in 1960, Nixon tried to run his own campaign and got too fatigued and made critical mistakes. In 1968, he says, okay, Mitchell's in charge. I'll do what Mitchell says. We'll go where Mitchell says. We'll do what Mitchell requires. Mitchell said, I don't want to come to work with you. Happy you're elected. See you around. And they importuned him, and they made him Attorney General. And Nixon said, you got to. You're the man I respect. You got to take over the Department of Justice. John does a very, very credible job running the Department of Justice. All kinds of career people will tell you that Mitchell was a superb Attorney General. He gets into trouble because of Watergate, but not because he was Attorney General. Well, as Watergate starts to unfold, Mitchell has resigned from Attorney General and come over to take over the 72 campaign. He takes over on March 1st, 1972. It's late. One of the phenomenons you'll find, Ricky, is in two-term presidencies, the guys who elected, men and women, who campaigned or successfully come into government, and when the time comes to run for re-election 4 years later, they're having too much fun and they don't want to go back to the dreary, demanding work of a campaign. If you go back to Bush 1, where Jim Baker was his guy, Jim Baker didn't want to leave being Secretary of State. It was too much fun to go do all the work or run in the campaign. So he put it off to the last minute. And many people think too many top-level people in Bush 1 put off going back to the campaign, and that's why he lost. So Mitchell put off going back to the re-election campaign, and these amateurs who were over there filling slots, most of whom were not involved in the 68 campaign. Most of the early arrivals at the committee to re-elect were kids like me. I mean, I wasn't involved in the campaign in 68, but I didn't go try to help in 72 either. I was busy having an absolute ball working for the domestic council. So Mitchell goes over. Watergate blows up. Martha thinks they're all going to blame her husband. She loves to drink. She gets on the phone at night with reporters and starts making incredible statements, which the reporters report. They love it. She feels important. She starts listening in on John's phone calls when he's at home. They live in an apartment in the Watergate hotel complex. And it's a roaring disaster. And then, remember, the break-in is June 17th, 1972. On July 1st, so this is 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks later, John Mitchell resigns as head of the re-election committee. And we all thought it was because of Martha, that he resigned and went home, moved back to New York to care for his alcoholic and dependent wife. But if you get to the tapes and you listen to the tapes, they were not, the people on the White House staff, Bob Haldeman in particular, were not at all sure but that Mitchell wouldn't have trouble because of the break-in, because he was head of the committee. And Haldeman tells the president says, well, did he tell you, do we know anything about John? And Haldeman says, well, I couldn't come right out and ask him, if he were guilty. But I did say, John, if this is going to lead, I'm paraphrasing, if this is going to involve you at some point, it may be better to leave now before that controversy arises. And so you can say, I believe, that Nixon comes back after the break, and he happens to be in Key Biscayne on Saturday, July 17th, when these arrests occur. Haldeman is apart from the president. He's off on a well-deserved 2 or 3 day vacation. They first get back together on June 20th, Tuesday, June 20th. And this is the 18-minute gap where we don't know what they said, but I think the president said, what's going on? What's happening here? And they said, it's not clear that John Mitchell's going to skate free on this. We just don't know. And so the president fired his best friend. And they encouraged John to go back to New York. And there is no record from his departure on July 1st, 1972, until March 22nd, 1973, okay, of Mitchell ever talking to Nixon. They kept him apart. He didn't meet with him. He didn't talk with him on the phone because they were worried that Mitchell may somehow be tainted. If the president was willing to fire his best friend on basically no evidence, just remote suspicion, imagine how quickly John Dean would have been fired if they had known Dean was in those same 2 meetings with Mitchell where Gordon Liddy's plan was discussed but not approved. So John Dean has this huge undisclosed conflict of interest. And no doubt in my mind they would have canned him without even looking back. But they didn't know. He misserved the president terribly through investigation. And then when it blew up, he said, they made me do it. Those people made me do it. And, of course, the press and the prosecutors loved him because they wanted to get to Nixon and Nixon's top people. They didn't care about John Dean.
Interesting.
That's Shepard on Watergate.
Wow. I think we hit on a lot today. I think this stuff's so interesting. It's definitely so interesting when you hear from somebody who knew the characters. They didn't just write about them or read somebody else's writing
right.
or interaction with these characters.
Right. I'm a primary source.
Yeah.
These other people who read documents and then say what they say, those are secondary sources, but I'm primary because I was there. Your listeners, if they want to know more from my perspective, I have a website, www.geoffshepard.com, and my name is spelled differently. It's GeoffShepard, www.geoffshepard.com, and I got all kinds of stuff. You can read more about the book. You can watch videos, read essays. There's stuff that's come out since my book was published, new documents that are up there on the website, and we kind of keep it up to date. And there's something coming next spring, this spring. I'm going to teach a course at Temple University on Watergate. It's going to be called Watergate Revisited: An Insider's View, and it will consist of 12 one-hour lectures, which will be videotaped, and then each one will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. And we're going to do it each week throughout this course. So I will have the opportunity to go into huge detail about what I found with regard to almost all aspects of Watergate and why I believe that Nixon was driven from office by the corruption of the special prosecution staff and a judge who was totally unfair and biased.
Yeah,
and that's a story the American public's never heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Nixon is that it's really easy to look at the way his career ended in politics and the kind of just see it in a negative light and not get the whole story. Everybody just thinks he's this crooked politician. But it's funny because they're all crooked. And like you talked about Kennedy's stealing the election. I mean, regardless what side you are on the political spectrum, everybody kind of agrees that there was a lot of dead people that voted for Kennedy, and
yes,
and all these old politicians too. There are a lot of them were linked to the mob. I think even Nixon had some links to the mob. Obviously, the Kennedys had links to the mob. So it was it's funny when people kind of let their I guess which political party you're part of kind of blur your vision on logic and history.
Nobody's pure. Nobody's pure. We're dealing with human beings. Money is hugely important in campaigns, and you got to have money to win. And politicians, not surprisingly, are willing to say anything to get elected.
Absolutely.
Tell me what you want. I'll tell you I believe in that if you'll vote for me.
Yeah, I mean, I've had Jack Abramoff on, and I mean, just look into how much influence lobbyists have on politicians, and the language that are put in bills, and just look at who's paying those politicians, who's paying for the campaigns.
And you wonder what we're going to do about it, Ricky, because we're bad as it is. We're the best nation in the world, and we come the closest to successful elections. And you go back to the Founding Fathers, their absolute certainty that power corrupts. And what we do is we divide power amongst three branches. We have checks and balances, and we believe and we support a free press. And we desperately want that free press to expose corruption. We can't make corruption go away. We can't legislate morality. But we can sure do our dead level best to be sure we learn about it, and we can take steps to respond when we learn about it. What you want is a vigorous and free press, not a biased press.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, everybody's a little biased. People tend to believe that they think they look at the facts and come up with the conclusion, but the truth is they look for the facts to help the conclusion they've already decided they want to highlight.
I think one of the greatest disservices that followed Woodward and Bernstein's disclosures is that mere reporters, not columnists, not editorial writers, mere reporters now want and expect their byline to be under every news or connected to news stories, and they write accordingly. They hype disclosures that aren't really that important. They're desperate to build readership and say to their publisher, "Look, my columns get a lot of attention."
Yeah.
I do videos. I do documentaries. I've produced in the last 8 years. I've helped to produce 39 documentaries on Richard Nixon, foreign affairs, domestic affairs. We do them in cooperation with the National Archives. And I'm not the expert. I'm the guy who helps put them together to actually produce these documentaries. Well, I did one on Watergate, and I was the only speaker, and I was disclosing some of the stuff I learned about Watergate. And this is back in 2010. This is before I knew as much as I know today. And I titled the presentation, Mysteries of Watergate. And it talks about those doubter books, those early books, and what makes them so attractive. I looked the other day on YouTube, 40,000 people have watched that video. And I think it has a lot to do with the title. I mean, I happen to think it is really interesting, and I think there are disclosures there that are fascinating. But I got to tell you, that's a lot of views.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially with the Trump thing happening right now and the Russian Gate and the similarities to Watergate, I think some interest. This was one of the reasons why. I mean, one, I love having these shows because no matter how much I think I know about any historical event. When I decide to do a show on the topic, it forces me to kind of research more into it, and I always learn I know nothing about the event. I know.
Well, but what you're saying is absolutely true. It's Trump's travails that have rekindled interest in what I've discovered about Watergate. In fact, my publisher is going to put out a paperback version and an audio version early next year, because the more people hear about the parallels, the more interested they are in finding out what actually happened or what we've uncovered from 50 years ago. Because they were assured back then, just as they're being assured today by the mainstream media, that Mueller's a professional, that these are not biased people, these are normal prosecutorial approaches, that this is equal protection of the law, that there's nothing wrong here. And yet, in Watergate, they did those same assurances, and there was everything wrong there. Every kind of corner was cut to get the president at all costs.
Yeah, and that's why...
And they succeeded.
Yeah, and that's why it's important even for myself. You were talking about how important the press is and the media, and I think one thing that I think the Trump administration has kind of exposed is just how biased the media is, and I think people kind of understood that prior to Trump becoming president, but now it's just so obvious that you can't deny it. It's irrefutable. Now they just hate Trump. Yeah,
and it shows. Well, but the bias is irrefutable, and half of the American public knows it and doesn't want to watch that, and the other half laps it up because they want to believe bad things. One of the observations the other day was that Trump could come out for Mother's Day and these people would oppose him.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing. I think that's a huge issue, and that's why it's, thank God there still is the internet, and there is podcasts and people like myself who are willing to look at everything from every angle and have, have people from the left on, I have people from the right, I have people, it's like, as long as you're willing to have an open discussion and it seems like you're being fairly honest. I always say on the show, my opinions are constantly changing, and it's hard for me. The more I learn about things, the less outspoken I am about anything, because I realize I know so little about everything, and when people
the word you want to use, Ricky, you don't want to use changing, you want to say evolving.
Evolving, absolutely.
Because you sincerely hold your opinions. And when new facts come to light or new arguments are made, you adjust.
Absolutely, yeah. And we all
adjust. It doesn't mean that you're like a pendulum where you're swinging back and forth. You're constantly, at least I think thoughtful people, constantly interested in new information.
Yeah, I think if like most people, I think we all, or at least most people, believe that they're in search of some type of truth. That means that you have to look at all perspectives, and you have to, regardless if sometimes the information gives you an outcome you don't necessarily like or want, and I think that's the hard thing to do is to kind of accept information that kind of maybe changes the conclusion you already had. And and again, there's two sides to every story. I know you brought up Silent Coup. I know there's been some reviewers in the past that talked about that book, not just being one-sided or whatnot, and other books being one-sided or whatnot. But even like I tell people all the time, I'm like, if somebody is biased or tends to shine a perspective on or focus on one perspective, you could still get a lot of good information out of that. It doesn't mean that all the information is incorrect. I might go on a liberal website and find some really good information on some corrupt conservative, and I might go on a conservative website and find some really good information on a corrupt liberal. So you
have to reason. We want to think that people reason from the facts, and that they're not motivated by harangues, and sometimes you got to be real careful. Does this person have factual information that ought to be considered, or is this person just repeating rumor and innuendo that has no basis in facts? That's why courts, they talk about cross-examination and testimony under oath. That's why courts require witnesses to show up in person, so that jury can watch and see them subjected to questions by both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll definitely...
All right, my friend. I'm going to have to go. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Same here, and I'll put all the links to your website and your social, your Twitter and your Facebook page on in the show notes, and I'll send you the link to the show once it's up, and feel free to share it and post it anywhere.
That's perfect.
Hey, thanks, Geoff.
You,
I really appreciate your time. Really a pleasure to hear your story, and hopefully we talk again in the near future.
I look forward to it. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.